This figure illustrates the short-run effects of a reduction in government purchases. In the short run, the inflation adjustment line does not shift, so the decrease in government purchases will result in a shift in the AD curve to the left. The new intersection between the new aggregate demand line and the inflation adjustment line determines the short-run GDP level, which is now below potential. Over time, the inflation rate will decrease and the IA line will shift downward because the economy is producing below the potential. This figure illustrates the dynamic adjustment in the real GDP after a reduction in government purchases. In the figure, the IA line in the medium run is lower than in the short run, while the IA line in the long run is lower than that in the medium run. The intersection between the new AD line with the IA lines for the medium run and the long run determine the medium run and long run real GDP for the economy. As the inflation adjustment line shifts downward, the equilibrium level of GDP increases. Note that the long run equilibrium real GDP for the economy is back at the potential GDP. From the figure, the decrease in government purchases resulted in a decrease in a recession in the short run, as real GDP decreased immediately after. The increase in real GDP through time illustrates the recovery of the economy from the recession. This figure provides details on the changes in each component of the real GDP in the short run and in the long run, when there is a reduction in government purchases. The arrows in the figure indicate what happens compared with what would have happened in the absence of a change in government purchases. Consumption. In the short run, the decrease in government spending decreases income, real GDP, resulting in a decrease in consumption, since consumption is positively related with income. In the long run, the increase in income brought about by the decrease in inflation will result in an increase in consumption. Investment. In the short run, the investment does not change because the change in government spending does not change the real interest rate. Inflation is also constant in the short run. In the long run, the decrease in inflation will force the Fed to lower the nominal interest rates, lower than the drop of inflation. This results in a lower real interest rate in the economy and a higher investment level. Net exports. In the short run, a lower income in the economy decreases imports and raises the net exports in the economy. In the long run, the interest rates that were lowered by the Fed will cause the exchange rate to depreciate and will allow net exports to increase. The increase in the components of GDP, which are C, I, and X, in the long run will raise GDP and bring the real GDP back to equilibrium. This is illustrated here. Disinflation is a reduction in the inflation rate. An example of disinflation is when the interest rate decreases from 10% to 8%. Deflation is a decrease in the overall price level, or a negative interest rate. An example of a deflation is when the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, or any other measure of the general price level decreases from 140 to 130. Recall, a change in the monetary policy toward inflation will shift the AD curve to the right. A change in the monetary policy toward disinflation will shift the AD curve to the left. This figure illustrates the changes in interest rates implemented by the Fed in 2001 and 2002. The decrease in interest rates during this period is consistent with the shift in the AD curve to the right. This figure illustrates the changes in interest rates implemented by the Fed in 2004 to 2006. The increase in interest rates during the period is consistent with the shift in the AD curve to the left. This figure illustrates the effects on the economy in the short run, medium run, and long run of a change in the monetary policy toward disinflation. In the short run, the AD curve will shift to the right, and the intersection between the IA curve with the new AD curve will determine the equilibrium GDP. In the medium run, the inflation adjustment curve will shift down and the inflation will drop as the GDP is below the potential. This is illustrated in this figure. As the drop in the IA line to the IA medium run line, the lower interest rate results in a recovering economy. In the long run, the intersection between the IA long run and the new AD curve is at the potential GDP and the economy has fully recovered. Reinflation is an increase in the inflation rate caused by a change in the monetary policy. A price shock is a change in the price of a key commodity such as oil, usually because of a shortage, that causes a shift in the inflation adjustment line, also sometimes called a supply shock. A demand shock is a shift of the components of the aggregate demand curve that leads to a shift in the aggregate demand curve. The real business cycle theory is a theory in macroeconomics that stresses that shifts in potential GDP are a primary cause of fluctuations in real GDP. Shifts in the potential GDP are usually assumed to be caused by changes in technology. This figure illustrates the effect of a price shock that results in a higher inflation adjustment line. The price shock can be caused by an increase in the price of oil or other commodities. In this figure, a higher IA line results in a GDP lower than potential GDP in the short run. Since the GDP is below potential, the inflation rate drops. The lower inflation rate causes the economy to grow in the medium run. In the long run, the economy is back at potential GDP. Stagflation is a situation in which high inflation and high unemployment occur simultaneously. In the previous figure, the intersection between the IA line and the AD curve is consistent with stagflation, as the economy experiences high inflation and a GDP below potential. This figure summarizes the economic fluctuations experienced by the US economy from 1995 to 2002. The top graph in the figure shows that the United States economy was above potential in 1996 through 2001 and below potential in 2001 through 2003. The bottom graph of the figure shows the inflation in the economy before 2001 and the disinflation in the economy between 2001 and 2002. This figure shows the behavior of the unemployment rate and the interest rates from 1995 through 2002. The top graph in the figure shows that the unemployment rate in the United States started to increase in 2001 after a continuous decline since 1995. The bottom graph in the figure shows that the interest rates in the economy dropped dramatically in 2001 until 2003. This figure illustrates the complete boom-bust cycle consistent with the United States experience from 1995 to 2002. The boom from 95 to 2001 was consistent with the shift in the AD curve to the right in the short run. As the economy was operating above potential, the inflation rate increased and the GDP started to decline. In 2001, the economy experienced a leftward shift in the AD curve, bringing the economy below the potential GDP. The decrease in the GDP pushed the IA line downwards, and the inflation rate decreased until the economy reached equilibrium.